Welcome to the Wolf Connection podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Let's talk about some wolves. Joining us from the Yellowstone Wolf Project, he's one of the biological science technicians, Jeremy SunderRaj, all the way in the northwest portion of Yellowstone. Jeremy, how you doing up there?
I'm doing good. How are you guys doing today?
We're doing great. We actually have a really nice day today. It's like 60-something degrees with no wind, and it's actually kind of warm.
Which is unusual lately.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice. It's a lot colder up here right now. I think we're in the 20s.
Yeah, Kira was telling us, I think 2 weeks ago, she said it's already dipping into the negatives, right?
Yeah, we had the worst day I think I've had this year is like -12 or -14 in the morning. Yeah, it'll probably get a little colder as the months wear on here. So,
what do you wear when it's that cold, when you're out in the field?
You just have a lot of layers on. So usually we have like fleece base layer, and then, you just kind of pile on the jackets.
So I want to quickly, because I was reading your bio, some of the stuff that Steven gave me, and tell the story of when you were, I believe you were 12 or 13 at the time, and you were visiting Yellowstone, and this kind of hooked you into wanting to at least study wolves and head in this direction. So just tell everybody that background story of how you really started to get fascinated with wolves in general.
Yeah, I know. Like, I was always interested in wildlife as a young kid. So I was like very into like insects and snakes and, all that other stuff. And just growing up, I'd catch bugs, catch snakes, and like play in a pond behind my house, looking at different small animals. And then my family actually in 2006 came to Yellowstone on vacation, but we actually ended up staying mostly in the Tetons. And I heard, there's wolves up here. And I really wanted to see a wolf. So my dad and I woke up at like 3 a.m, and we ended up just driving around the Tetons looking for wolves, which, is a lot harder than seeing a wolf in Yellowstone. And there was a coyote that crossed the road in front of us. And for that first year, until the next summer when I came back to Yellowstone, I was claiming that was a wolf the whole time. And then I actually called Doug Smith or wrote him a letter. And he won't remember this at all because I'm sure he gets, tons of letters from little kids. And I said, hey, like, I'm coming back to Yellowstone next summer. Like, where can I see wolves? And he actually called my dad and said, hey, you can see them in Lamar Valley. And so we went to Lamar Valley that next summer. I was 11 years old in 2007. And we found, this big group of people at one of the turnouts there looking across the valley. And they were looking at a grizzly bear with 2 cubs. And actually Rick McIntyre, who was there as well. And I didn't know that at the time. I was standing right next to him. I, would end up working with him quite a bit later in my life. And then all of a sudden someone just yelled, oh, there's wolves behind us. And we look on the ridge behind us. And I think 4 or 5 wolves came over the top of the hill from the Slough Creek pack. And they actually separated a couple of black bear cubs from their mother and killed them like relatively close to the road. And, I always tell people that I might have been a little bit of a twisted kid because I thought it was pretty awesome. My sister was a little upset about it. But that was kind of the start for me. Those are the first wolves I ever saw. And since then, I've been obviously fairly interested in them. So it was quite the way it started all out.
Man, that's a crazy story because when I read it, I go, like you said, most probably young kids would be, fairly, maybe not traumatized, but just sort of taken aback by that. But you dove right in. And then you started volunteering, right, at Yellowstone before you went off to college in Montana. Do I have that right?
Yeah, basically what happened is like I was pretty into it. And so like our family, since I just grew up in Denver, would come back, 1 or 2 weekends a year. Just to kind of watch the wolves and see what was going on. And I was actually offered a job at a general store in Silvergate, Montana. And I worked there for 3 summers from when I was 16 years old to basically the summer after I graduated from high school. And I would just go out every morning and watch wolves in my free time before I, worked my shift at the store. And I, doing that, I fell in with a lot like Rick McIntyre and the Wolf Project. And I saw, a lot of really crazy stuff for sure. So it's a pretty incredible experience. That first summer for me, I always compare it to kind of being like watching a National Geographic film. That was the last year the famous 06 female was alive. So I was, as a 16-year-old kid, kind of like living there in a way by myself. We saw her kill elk by herself. We saw her raising her pups. She many times was very, very close to me. I actually watched her kill a wolf from another pack at one point. So in that, that 3-month period, it was just a lot of crazy stuff to see for sure.
Can you describe what exactly is a biological science technician in better words than we probably can?
A biological science technician usually is like sort of younger, generally speaking. It would be younger age people who are starting out in the field. A lot of times they'll just have maybe their degree, and oftentimes, they're relatively low paying salaries, and they do a lot of the field work. So, for example, for the Wolf Project, being a biological science technician, a big part of my job is education. So I'm out on the road almost every day, facilitating people who have questions about wolves or helping them see them if they're in view from the road. We also help with a lot of the different research projects. Like, for example, we hike to a lot of the different kills wolves make and take samples from those. And we're involved in a lot of the winter study projects as well. So we do that kind of stuff. But usually, like a biological science technician will probably, the goal is probably to go back to grad school and get another degree. And then hopefully you can, further your career in wildlife from there.
Yeah. I think you did a better job.
Yeah, way better.
Way better job. So when you're on this path though, because you went to University of Montana, I believe, and you were already studying, and were you collaring wolves at that point, or were you were doing, I think, the biological science tech stuff at University of Montana for the wolves in Montana? Am I right with that?
Right. Well, something like that. So I was just a volunteer for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and then I ended up being a technician for at least a year there. And what happened there is, again, I just kind of asked Tyler Parks, who is the head of or the wolf specialist in the Missoula area for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or FWP, if he needed any help that summer. And he said, "Yeah, I'll take you on as a volunteer." And that was definitely one of the best decisions I'd ever made in my life was learning from Tyler. Is a very good wolf trapper. We caught a lot of wolves that summer, and those were my first capture experiences. And because it was just me and Tyler, I was able to be very involved with capture, to learn. I was able to set a lot of traps by myself, kind of like experiment. And I'm sure, there are a lot of times when he thought, wow, those traps are terrible. But I ended up catching a couple my first summer. Somehow, I don't really know.
What do those traps look like? What was the setup?
So for FWP, what we're mainly using for wolves are rubber jawed leg hold traps. So it's just like kind of a snap trap. And you'll about a 6-inch, we'd always use our hand like that, kind of like, the phone, like, so from here to here. And then you would put that at the back of the trap or from the pan, and you'd put like a little sense, a lure of some sort. And the wolf hopefully would step on the pan, get caught in the trap. And then, we'd come around and then anesthetize the wolf, put a radio collar on it, and let it go. It's catching a wolf is a lot harder than you think. And they're very smart. We had plenty of times when, we'd set up some traps and wolves out there get trapped and killed by people. So a lot of them know what traps are, and they'll actually come through and dig up all your traps or spring them all. So we had quite a few interesting experiences with wolves that got kind of smart to us. But it was definitely a fun learning experience. You learn a lot about wolves. Being out there interacting with them and trying to trap them, as opposed to just watching them, like a lot of times we do in Yellowstone. So
it was a little bit more hands-on in Montana. What are some of the hands-on things that you do with the Yellowstone Wolf Project as you transitioned out from college and into your professional career now with this? Yeah,
hands-on for technicians, it's not quite as much as it was with FWP. So my job is not necessarily to be on captures right now. I have been on a handful of captures in Yellowstone, which is also a good experience. In Yellowstone, we use helicopters to catch our wolves. And so basically, a pilot will fly over the wolves, and we'll either net gun them and then hand inject them with the drug, or like we were mentioning earlier, Dan Staler or Doug Smith will actually dart them from the helicopter themselves. And then a lot of times we'll have the chance to walk out and assist with the capture. So we'll draw blood. We take a lot of different samples, weigh the animal, put the radio collar on it, and then kind of wait for them to recover. And then they're free to go, basically.
And is that process different in Yellowstone so that there's as little human interference or interaction as possible, as opposed to maybe what you were doing in Montana? Or are both of these types of capture and release made so that there's as little human interaction as possible?
I think both, are made for sure that you try to minimize the human interaction with the animals. I would say Yellowstone is probably less so. There's just a lot more samples that we take in Yellowstone, right? So because Yellowstone does a lot more like little research projects on wolves as opposed to the state, which is more interested in just how many they have. So like in Yellowstone, we swab all these different parts of the wolf and take different samples. We take whiskers to look at the isotopes and all that kind of stuff. And out like at FWP, sometimes I feel like you basically just slap the collar on the animal. If you can, draw some blood and weigh it, and then it's free to go. So there's definitely a difference. But I would say in either situation, there's not a lot of, we try to minimize our time handling the animals as much as possible.
Yeah, because you mentioned with some of the articles I was reading, you reference, I think it's called wolf hazing. And when I think of hazing, I think when I was in college and it was hazing of younger students and things like that from the the senior class or the
Frats.
junior frats and stuff like that. Not to put down frats, I'm just saying that that's what I think of. So what hazing, when you're hazing the wolves, and I think it's part of a larger conversation that we were just talking about with little bit limited human interaction. What goes into hazing and what are the types of hazing that goes on, especially in Yellowstone?
Right. So, wolf hazing, like generally speaking, is pretty specific to a few areas, right? Like Yellowstone wolves are, number one, they're very visible. So people from almost, anywhere can come and have a chance to see these animals, which is a blessing and a curse, right? It's good for people to see them and to learn about them. But these wolves do learn, they're smart animals, that, these people really aren't a threat to them, not really doing anything. And because of that, they're more and more comfortable being around and being close to people. So like a big story that we had over the last couple of years is the Junction Butte pack, which at the moment is the most visible pack in the park. 2 summers ago, they had their pups on a popular trail in the park. And, we closed the area surrounding the trail. And we were up there almost every day. And what basically I do is I will shoot the wolves with paintballs to try to keep them away from people so that they, learn, like when they're approaching the road or approaching the trail, that's not a good thing. And they hopefully will associate people with, bad experiences. Unfortunately, these pups learn from a very early age, because photographers and wolf watchers and, other general public were going up there and getting close to these pups, that people are not a bad thing. And we've really been dealing with the repercussions from that for, basically the last year and a half now. Unfortunately, we had 2 of those pups that were hit by cars. There's some argument that could have been due to habituation, right? And then there was another wolf that we actually thought we might have to lethally remove because he was just so comfortable around people. And so like a big part of my job, so human safety is the number one thing we worry about, obviously. Of course, wolves don't really attack people, but we try to keep people safe. And then the second is wolf safety. So if we do the best we can to make sure we kind of maintain the resource. And so like if I have wolves that are close to the road or are comfortable, I will try to hit them with paintballs or call in like bear management or the rangers to hit them with rubber bullets. And that's just to kind of aversively condition them so that they learn that people are bad and to stay away from the road.
And does that unnatural exposure that they have to, well, at least the unnatural amount of exposure that they have to humans, does that play any part in, do you think, in your ability as biologists to study them and see accurate wild results?
Yeah, I mean, to some level, you absolutely could argue that, right? Like, I mean, is it the same studying a wolf pack in Yellowstone as it is studying a wolf pack that's in Montana? I mean, I can already tell you no, right? There's definitely a difference. But I've heard there's definitely interesting arguments about like how natural it is, right? Because like growing up, I always considered like the wolves that lived in Montana to be like the truly wild wolves, right? As opposed to the wolves in the park, which are kind of more habituated to people. But then, one of my friends came up to me the other day and he was like, well, I think the Wapiti Lake pack, which is, again, one of our habituated packs, or our more habituated packs, is actually a good example of a truly wild wolf pack. And I looked at him, because these wolves will walk right down the road at you. And I looked at him and I was just like, what? And he said, well, I mean, before people, they interacted with people and were shot by people in a truly natural system, that's probably how they would act, right? Like just being comfortable walking by people and not interacting with them. So you can kind of look at it from either perspective. But that was an interesting perspective that he had, I thought, as opposed to what I had always thought that, the ones outside were a little more wild. But it's interesting for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, how does that balancing act go for you and your colleagues when you're trying to give tourists or wolf watchers the opportunity to witness an animal that they may never see, to, keeping that, like you said, that habituated behavior out of the wildness of them?
Yeah, it's a huge gray area, right? And again, this is an argument that I've had in Yellowstone with a lot of different people. A lot of, my friends are photographers who have to be somewhat close to wolves to get decent shots. And, an argument is that these wolves are the wolves that a family from New York who might never have the chance to be in the West again, will come out to Yellowstone National Park and have the chance to see these animals. And they can, possibly I would be there, or Rick McIntyre, or, whoever else from the Wolf Project, or one of the knowledgeable wolf watchers. And they have the opportunity to see these animals and to ask questions about them. But then, there's the dark side of it is that, what gets these animals killed? Is that what gets them hit by cars? Or, if we were to get into wolf hunting at all, whatever you feel about wolf hunting outside the park is kind of whatever it is. But you can definitely make the argument that it's one thing to hunt a wolf pack that's, lived in Montana their whole lives and has been shot at and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to a wolf pack like the Junction Butte pack, which most of them grew up in Yellowstone National Park being watched by people and therefore don't think people are bad. It makes it a little bit of an easier target. And of course, people are exposed to these wolves through things like social media, right? So, for example, if I have a good photographer takes a really good picture of a wolf, that might reach many more people than the wolves that are living in Montana or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a gray area of balancing out. We do want people to be able to see wolves and to be able to learn from those experiences and kind of create that interest and that passion. But we also want to make sure that we're not habituating wolves to the point where it's negative to their survival, right? I guess I compare it to as a kid, I watched a lot of documentaries about tigers. But I didn't really think they were necessarily that cool. I saw them on the Discovery Channel all the time. And I was like, okay, tigers are cool. And then I went to India and I saw a tiger. And then I really thought tigers were cool, right? So actually being able to see that animal and interact with that animal, it makes their plight much more real to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. It must make like you said, the plight and the conservation effort and the project that you are all involved in, it brings it to another level and a more personal level for that individual, that family, whoever it is that comes there, because they are visibly seeing the animal that you're working with, that you're taking samples of, that you are trying to keep this reintroduction project moving in a positive direction.
There's estimates that over some years, over 100,000 people will see, have seen wolves in Yellowstone or something like that, right? So very, very large numbers of people. And, I can't help but think back to myself, right? If, I was standing next to Rick McIntyre that day, if those wolves didn't run over the hill that day, am I where I am now, Right. And that's, you never know, who's coming through or what or how someone's life could change because of a certain encounter. Or even if, if they go and tell, 10 of their friends that the wolves of Yellowstone are really cool, that can spread pretty rapidly. So even if it's just kind of public awareness, I think that's at least something.
And do some of the visitors' funds go back into conservation to any degree?
So we get most of our funding through nonprofit donations. We have like, I think 3 salaries that are funded through the National Park Service, through the government. And that shifts pretty frequently, but a lot of ours are through private donations. And those donations a lot of times do come from people who are in the field who do see wolves. And that does help us, carry on with our research in the park, doing our monitoring, doing our different research projects, our management. So to some degree, I would say, yes, it does trickle down. To what level, I think it's kind of hard to say.
Wow.
Like habituation is it's an unfortunate thing, because we do want people to have the opportunity to come out here and to learn about these animals and to see them. And to some level, they do have to be a little bit more habituated than the wolves in Montana, right? For example, I worked in Montana for 3 summers, and I saw wolves, more than most people would have, because I was out tracking them all the time. But still, it's not comparable to Yellowstone, where, pretty much every single day we're seeing wolves in the park. And people, again, can basically, drive their minivan with their kids out and have a cup of coffee in their hands and step out, and we'll say, look through the spotting scope, and you can see the wolf around down there.
I want to ask too with those spotting scopes, because I never asked Rick or Kira, for that matter, how far can those spotting scopes see from? Is it miles? What's the range usually on those spotting scopes?
Yeah, and I mean, you can definitely look at stuff I've looked at, Jupiter and Saturn through my spotting scope, right? So you can look a long ways. It'll be relatively small, but we can pretty easily see a couple miles away and get a good idea of what's going on with behavior. So a spotting scope is a pretty big tool. So, usually they go about 20 to 60x zoom. And that's our big tool for observation in the park is spotting scopes. So we've learned a lot sitting there and looking through a scope for hours at wolf packs.
And I mean, speak to your influences, because you've brought up Rick a bunch of times. I mean, how much influence have Rick and Doug had, from your teenage years through now? I mean, you're obviously working with Doug, on a side by side. But how did that influence help you working with Rick early on?
Yeah, I mean, Rick was huge. I would not be where I am now without Rick. He was basically my first connection with the Wolf Project. And he was always very outgoing, willing to speak to people like Doug and say, Jeremy, this kid is actually somewhat good at what he does, and maybe you should look into at least talking to him or hiring him at Sunday, which looking back on it, I'm sure Doug regrets to some level. But yeah, and then Doug's been a great mentor for me. He's taught me a lot. I've learned a lot about wolves from him. I wouldn't be where I am. I also have to shout out again to my boss at FWP, Tyler. I learned most of what I know about wildlife biology from him. And he's not a super well-known name in wolf biology, but he's probably one of the best wolf trappers in the state of Montana. And he's a really good guy and knows wolves really, really well. And I definitely would not be where I am today without him. They played a big part in my development as a young biologist. And I would not be where I am without those 3.
So when you, I'm jumping around because you're just saying stuff that it's bringing up. So when you're in Montana and you're working with Tyler, did you ever did you ever have conversations with anybody who's on the opposite side of, the wolf introduction or wolf conservation, and just being able to handle those conversations at a young age and understanding what to say and how to really talk about that? So anybody who's anti-wolf, let's say, to put it in simple terms.
Yeah. Or at least anti-introduction.
Anti-reintroduction, basically. How did those conversations usually go?
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? So and I've noticed it on both sides of the spectrum. You're asking about people who are anti, but I started working in Yellowstone, or at least being out watching wolves in my free time in Yellowstone. And in Yellowstone, almost all the people you to are very pro-wolf. So they're very wolf friendly, and you get to talking to these people in the field, and they have their ideals, right? Or their ideas, their mindset is set on how wolves should be managed. So, a lot of people out there say wolves should never be hunted. Kind of things like that. No wolf should ever die. Ranchers should just take a loss is one that I hear a lot. And then being all of a sudden thrown into the state of Montana, you see a very different mindset. So it was very frequently, Tyler and I would be trapping out some back roads in Montana. And this group of people, like a group of hunters, would show up and they'd just start talking to us, like relatively nice people, and they were just, chatting with the fish and game guys, basically. And we always tried to just not say what we were doing if we could help it. But a lot of times it would come up, and, they would always make comments like, we're going to smoke a pack a day, or shoot, shovel, and shut up, and all that kind of stuff. But I can't remember who said it. It was one of the, it was, I don't know if it was Doug or one of his colleagues, something like, I've never known a wolf hater to become a wolf advocate. So a lot of times it's not really worth getting all worked up about it. Like a lot of times if someone said, oh, we're going to smoke a pack a day, Tyler and I would just say good luck, because, it's very, very difficult to shoot a wolf. Number one, you're not going to kill a whole pack in a day, almost certainly. So they have their mindsets, but, a lot of these people have never even killed a wolf before, and they're just trying to kind of ruffle your feathers. But it's very important, I think, to understand where those people are coming from too, right? Like it is tough, for example, for ranchers, they live paycheck to paycheck. And if wolves do come in and, take a cow or something, that can be a big deal. And it's very easy, like I've told people before, just for us to sit back while we're watching the Junction Butte pack play with their pups in Yellowstone and say, those guys need to take a loss. That's very, very easy to say, right? But what if he can't, afford books for his, college daughter or something like that? So we've the best progress with wolves and wolf conservation is made when the groups can kind of come to the ground and work together. And that actually, like, I'll bring up another group, the Blackfoot Challenge. I don't know if you guys have heard of them or not. Is a bunch of different sort of interest groups that work together in the Blackfoot Valley near Missoula. With different ranchers, trappers, and the biologists. So Tyler and I, spent a lot of time working with those people. And they all work together to try to kind of coexist with predators and preserve their valley as it is. And a lot of the ranchers and trappers out there went through, this phase, at least when it started out, that they really, really hated wolves. And then, we were able to implement some kind of non-lethal methods to prevent livestock depredation. So we would do things like take carcasses and mulch them, so predators like grizzlies and wolves didn't kind of get the taste of the flesh of cows. We would put up flaggery, which is like flapping flags that kind of scare wolves away. And then we had range riders. And I remember, asking one of the ranchers up there one time, like, when was the last time you had a depredation? And he said, oh, it's been 16 or 17 years. And I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy, right? Because there's a ton of wolves. And one of the packs actually rendezvous in the same pasture he has his cows in, which as a rancher, that's a pretty terrifying thing, right? You would think. But it is interesting to see how they've changed their mindsets, at least a little bit. Like, I think all of them would still shoot a wolf, like if given the opportunity, but I don't think that they hate the idea of having wolves in the landscape, which is a pretty big turnaround. Like, for example, there was one case where a calf was killed, and one of the ranchers there in the Blackfoot Valley, when asked if, they wanted to take out the whole pack, he said, no, just shoot that one yearling that killed the calf, because the alpha pair are good wolves. And to see that shift, I think that's where changes are actually made. So.
Wow, that's really interesting. And because we spoke with Jim Halfpenny, and he really said a lot of what you're saying is it has to come from both sides, and that he himself has seen a lot of positive movement in that shift of ranchers and others that may not be so keen on reintroduction of wolves, that if they can sort of, again, if, like you said, if you can hit that gray area, that middle ground where we're not killing an entire pack, but we're sort of managing our way through this a little bit, there can be some coexistence. I mean, Stephen always asks a great question. I'll save it for you to ask. You always ask about like what, like the what's your optimal?
Yeah. Like,
I'm saying you always ask that.
Yeah,
but but like, so when you get from Montana and dealing with that, that must be a great teaching ground for you, so that when you get to Yellowstone, you're more on the pro side now because you're in Yellowstone. I'm sure the majority of people there are pro wolf reintroduction, and you're able to really give them both sides of the story because of your experience, right?
Absolutely. And I really do think that, my time working in Montana helped me to see that other side. See it a lot better, because like people are always arguing like, oh, I don't think there's very many wolves in Montana, or I don't think the management is doing very well. And then I'm working in Montana and I say, I have 200 wolves in just my region of Montana that I know about. And I'm fairly certain on at least that count. And it's funny, people will come from, like California or New York or something to Yellowstone, and they'll tell me, oh yeah, you don't have enough wolves. And it's like, you don't know, right? So you can see why these ranchers and hunters and trappers to the point where they get frustrated with that kind of mindset. So actually a very long time wolf watcher out here in Yellowstone, Lori Lyman, said to me one time, the bleeding hearts don't help wolves. And so the people who are way over the top and are like saying, you can't hunt wolves, you should never, the ranchers need to take a loss. In the long run, those people are not changing anyone's minds, right? So like interacting with these ranchers and kind of getting to know them on a personal level, or the trappers or anything like that, you can at least have that conversation. And again, maybe they'll probably still shoot a wolf if they see it. But if they have the mindset that there can be wolves on the landscape still, I think that's kind of our end goal anyways, right? Because we don't want, as people who are wolf advocates, we don't want wolves out there killing cows. That's not what wolves are supposed to do anyways, right?
Yeah.
So what we want is wolves preying on their natural prey. And to some level, that's the compromise that we should be at least probably shooting for.
Right. And to a large degree, we don't want ranchers going out of business completely either. I mean, if we were to give up their place on the stage, it would make those areas much more vulnerable to interests that maybe don't care about wolves at all.
A good way to think of it is we can have wolves in Yellowstone, but if they don't survive outside the park in the long run, that species is not going to exist anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And there's a lot of, private land out there that's on, ranch land that these wolves live on. And that's how they're able to survive. And that's kind of the beauty of sort of the mosaic of different land types in the Western United States. So we have Park Service, we have Forest Service, we have private land, and that's all somehow or the other, preserved or conserved, however you want to look at it. And that allows these animals to survive and for wolves to be connected, right? Like our reintroduction program in Yellowstone National Park and recovery of wolves to the west has been incredibly successful. So for us to say that we think wolves are in danger of going extinct is just not true, right? Like right now I have about 300 wolves in Wyoming, about 800 wolves in Montana, and about 1,000 in Idaho, give or take, depending on who you ask. And our goals were 150 in each state, right? And we see connectivity basically from central Wyoming along the Rocky Mountain chain all the way to Alaska. And for, the survival of species, that's huge. But we can't achieve that without national forest land and without ranch land. So if you were to cut out the ranchers, there'd be a lot of land that might be subdivided into housing units or something like that, and where these animals can't live anymore. So it is very important to realize, to preserve these wild, lands that all of us, ranchers as well and hunters as well, of course, and advocates all appreciate. We have to work together to do that.
And because I want to touch on that, because you lived in Denver, you grew up in Denver. Stephen is actually moving to Colorado in a couple of weeks. With Colorado on the brain right now, what impact does the prop to reintroduce wolves in Colorado on that western side of the state? How is that going to affect you guys in Yellowstone at all? And like you said, those wild populations in Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. Like, what do you know what the process is? I know it's early on and you may not have anything, but just what are your initial thoughts of that?
So it's a difficult topic, right? For biologists, for the general public, and we can look at the pluses and minuses of all of it, right? So I will just start out by saying, like, right now we don't know a lot about what that process is going to look like. It comes down to Colorado Parks and Wildlife and their planning. So we don't know where they're going to reintroduce wolves in the state yet, except that it's probably going to be on the west, or it is going to be on the west slope. We don't know where they're going to get the wolves from. We don't exactly know the cost or where the money is coming from to complete that process. So there's a lot of unknowns still. It's very early on. But what, Proposition 114 on the Colorado ballot this year basically said was that Colorado Parks and Wildlife has to create a management plan that has wolves on the ground by 2023, by the end of 2023. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Of course, the interesting sort of like kink in the works was that there's wolves in Colorado right now. Right. And I don't know if you guys saw this or not. But actually in the summer of 2019, we lost track of one of our Yellowstone wolves from the Snake River pack. He had a radio collar. He's a 2-year-old male, 1084, a black male. And our pilot found him kind of at the edge of the Wyoming Wolf Range near Lander, Wyoming in the winter. And then he was just disappeared. And then all of a sudden, someone took a picture of a black canine wearing a radio collar near Walden, Colorado. And sure enough, our wolf, 1084, is now running around in Colorado. And as of October, Colorado Parks and Wildlife said he's still alive down there. And at least right now, we don't really, I have not heard whether or not he's with other individuals or not, but he basically survived walking across all of Wyoming and now is hanging out in Colorado.
Wow. Yeah, actually, I think I saw a trail camera footage of like last week of a wolf that was not black. So there must be multiple.
And there are. So like that kind of brings me back to the story in general. Last October, a hunter who was hunting in the very far northwest corner of Colorado took a video of what he said were 6 gray canids that he thought were wolves. And Colorado Parks and Wildlife went in there and they set up these trail cameras. And sure enough, it looks like there's a wolf pack in the northwest corner of the state of Colorado right now.
Love it.
And this summer, a biologist who was up there reported seeing what she thought was a pup. So it's very possible that there's actually wolves breeding in Colorado right now. However, we got a report, because I don't know how well Wyoming's wolf management or not, but the area around Yellowstone, about 15% of the state, is what they call a trophy game zone. So the wolf management there usually runs from the hunting season will run from September through about December 31st, depending on the unit, and there's quotas. Outside of that, wolves are classified as a predator, which can be shot on site pretty much year round. And a lot of people kind of freak out about that. But what we also have to realize is that most of the state of Wyoming is kind of like the Badlands in Cheyenne, which doesn't have wolves anyways. So they're only killing like 20 or so wolves in the predator zone every year. Unfortunately, that pack in Colorado is living right on the border there. And there were 2 wolves that were at least 2 wolves. I think they were both yearlings from when I talked to the Wyoming guys that were harvested possibly from that pack just over the Wyoming-Colorado border. So it's interesting as you go from, at one point what was a federally protected species in Colorado to stepping over a border and then you're a shoot-on-sight predator. So that's the argument of a lot of people who are for reintroduction is that, it's going to be difficult for wolves to establish themselves in Colorado. The arguments, against reintroduction, like a big one is that they probably actually will eventually establish themselves in the state. And we're seeing that happen, right? Like right now, wolves that get down to Colorado through Wyoming have the potential of meeting up with other wolves now. And that wasn't the case, 4 or 5 years ago, because the first wolf that actually made it to Colorado was hit by a car near Idaho Springs in 2004. So they've been dispersing down there for, decades now. It's just no one has actually been able to set up a population.
That's far east.
And the other big issue with the Colorado reintroduction too, like the ballot initiative, is it's unprecedented because basically it took the decision out of the hands of the biologist and put it in the hands of the general public. And that sets a dangerous precedent. Right? Like, do I think Colorado could use a wolf population? Yeah, for sure. And I think they're going to get it either way. It's just a matter of time. But, to ask the general public how to manage wildlife, you never know what answer you're going to get. Right? So, for example, I ask a lot of people in Colorado, how would you feel if instead of wolves, it was grizzly bears, which sometimes kill people? Right? Someone's probably going to get attacked by a grizzly bear if you reintroduce them into Colorado. And that's the precedent that sets, right? Are you okay with grizzlies coming back? And then are you okay with whatever the next species might be? Because it sets a precedent to kind of override the biologist's decision and go with the decision of the general public, which may not always be the most educated decision. Like for putting wolves back, I don't see it as necessarily a bad thing, and arguably not even grizzlies. But you never know what's next, right? So it's kind of a dangerous thing.
Right. And the argument that I've been hearing, they're already coming in on their own. Why force it? But I'm not really sure of the basis of that argument. So what do you think of that argument, that why should we introduce them if they're already there?
Yeah, it's a good point, right? Like, and it's funny because, just with a lot of things, how the year's been going and all this other stuff, I've talked with a lot of people about how, like, we always repeat history. We've been through this before, right? We put wolves back in Yellowstone, and this was the same argument people had. Like, there were biologists who weren't sure that we should put wolves back into Yellowstone because just before wolves were reintroduced, there was a sighting of a black wolf-like animal in Hayden Valley, and then a wolf was shot in near the Tetons, right? A black wolf. And so the argument was made, if they just naturally come back on their own, there'll be less controversy, which is a huge thing, right? The ranchers and the local people will not feel like, the people from Denver, the people from wherever push the animal down their throat.
Right.
So that's a big thing, right? So you can definitely say that's a good argument. But in the long run, the reason that they put wolves back in Wyoming had a lot to do with the management of the animals. So they were an endangered species across the entire extent of their range or at least in the lower 48 states at that point. And that meant that, like, naturally recolonizing wolves, they couldn't be touched. So if they killed cows, if they, you couldn't disturb them, you couldn't kill them for sure, right? Like, you couldn't, if you got close to dens or something like that, it's a felony. And that was actually the case too in Colorado. And so that's why a lot of people were pushing for reintroduction too, was because at the time wolves are federally listed. So disturbing or killing a wolf in Colorado, if they naturally, recovered, I mean, that's like the same as killing a condor or a black-footed ferret, right? So a big time offense. But if we reintroduce them, there's a section of the Endangered Species Act, which is Section 10J, if you're really getting into it, that allows you to classify that population as experimental and non-essential. And that allows for management, right? For example, if we were to put 30 wolves back into Colorado, and they were still federally listed, and we classified them as an experimental non-essential population, then management decisions like lethal removal could be made by the state if that was necessary to protect livestock. You wouldn't have to worry as much about, people like skiing or snowmobiling or whatever that might be in areas that are used by wolves. Of course, the federal delisting that just happened changed that whole situation. So it's a little more interesting now, but you can really get into a lot of, like, the letter of the law stuff, which just gets complicated. But we've been through this whole situation before in Yellowstone.
Clearly, all of your organizations are talking. Obviously, you guys at the Wolf Project are talking with the folks in Montana, in Colorado. I'm sure you're all talking and discussing how to keep the project and moving in a positive way. Is there anything that you guys have talked about since the prop has passed? Is there anything, obviously that you said there's not a lot of information, but are they trying to take pieces from you guys about how Yellowstone went and sort of using that as a baseline, or are they not even at that point yet?
I think, like, not completely to that point yet, but there's definitely some talk between Wyoming and Colorado about managing wolf populations and how that works, right? It's something that, like, in Montana, we'd always talk about states like Washington and Oregon, saying, you don't need to recreate the wheel. We've already been in there. We've done it, right? And so, like, if we, learn from history, we can probably find the best way to go about recovering these species. Unfortunately, everyone has a different mindset of what that should be, right? So, for example, a lot of biologists think, we probably had wolves listed for a while too long in, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. And that, didn't, like, prove well or go well for improving attitudes towards wolves. And, it's, again, best to compromise with a lot of these people. So, it's best to keep your promises, right? If you say you're going to delist wolves at a level, 150, and you probably should do that. Even though I'm saying that right now, I know that in Colorado, it would be the same situation we had here, where environmental groups will sue to keep the animals on the endangered species list longer than they probably should be. And, the people who are anti-wolf will again push to, kill as many as they can. So there's no, unfortunately, they can be their own worst enemies when it comes to that.
If you could paint a perfect picture of what you ideally want all of this to look like for wolves, what does it look like in an ideal utopia sort of perfect place? Like everyone's pro-wolf, wolves are restored to X, Y, and Z, or coexistence is enough?
In a perfect world for me, I think you have to look at coexistence, right? Because in all reality, wolves are very, very tough animals to live with. Any wolf biologist is going to tell you that it's easier to live without wolves than it is to live with wolves, because they do cause problems at points. A perfect world, I always think that it's really tough to say what a perfect world looks like, because what is a perfect world today? We've seen, again, incredible wolf recovery, right? Like I said, in the 3 states up here, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, there's no worry about wolf extinction, right? They're doing very, very well. In the states of Oregon and Washington, they're starting to see their populations take off. I don't know. I mean, you guys have a wolf pack for the first time in Northern California right now, right? Mm-hmm. Your Lassen pack up there by the Lassen Volcanic Park, I think, had 9 pups this year. There's 15 wolves or so in the pack, which is incredible, right? And so, actually, when I give my talks, if I have someone like Doug Smith in the audience, or, Nathan Varley or Linda Thurston, or someone who is involved with the reintroduction, I always ask them, just kind of as a point, and I say, did you ever think there would be wolves in California? And everyone would say no, right? There was no thought in 1995 when wolves were put back in Yellowstone that we would see wolves in California ever, right? That was not on the table. And right now, with the reintroduction or recovery, whichever happens first in Colorado, we're looking at recovery across the western United States, right? Wolves from Colorado are going to spill into Utah, northern New Mexico and Arizona, possibly interconnect with the Mexican wolf population. Recovery will continue in Washington and Oregon and California. They'll bleed into Nevada a little bit. So what we're looking at right now is saying that every state in the western United States is going to have a wolf population, probably, in my opinion, in the next 20 years or so. Which is incredible, right?
Incredible. Yeah.
We went from 0 in the 1970s to saying we might have this species almost completely recovered in the West. As a wolf advocate, or as people who are wolf advocates, that's a huge win, right?
Unreal.
Even if we do have hunting seasons on all of them in all these different states, a lot of people are against that, and still, I think, that's the price of having wolves. We agreed when we put wolves back that if they did recover, they'd be hunted. And, as a biologist, I like the idea of wolves being, another animal on the landscape, right? Why is a wolf more important than a mountain lion or an elk or a mule deer or a grizzly bear or whatever, right? So if we can get to the point where wolves are just another animal on that landscape and they're managed just like the other animals, we can look at it as a huge success story, bringing a species that was gone. There were none left, back to a sustainable level where it was almost, they're pretty much occupying all the territory they could occupy. So huge success story, right? And
that's
look at, and then it comes back down to us, or working with people like ranchers, people like hunters, and trying to make sure that their needs are at least somewhat met as well. So we can find the best way to live with wolves, which is a very, very complex issue. And again, there's a lot of gray areas, just kind of like how we were talking about habituation either. And there's no perfect answer. So it'll be interesting to see as we go forward how these different states deal with it, and what decisions are made.
Man, I love that. That's awesome. I have one last question for you, Jeremy, before we let you go. When you hear the word wolf, what is something that comes to your mind?
What is something that comes to my mind? Oh man, that's a tough question, right? For me, wolves, they're just synonymous, like, to me, with my whole life, right? Like, I grew up with wolves, and to me, like, I can't imagine a world without wolves, right? Like, I was very excited by them when I was a young kid. Right now, they pay the bills at the moment, right? And yeah, I mean, they're an animal I'm very passionate about. An animal in a way that, I can also think that they've caused a lot of trouble for me, a lot of trouble for a lot of other people. So that's kind of what I think about when I think about wolves. But, in the long run, to me, a beautiful animal that, it's neither good nor evil. But for me, that has been very important and influential in my life.
It's awesome. Beautiful.
Jeremy, give us a website, or if you have an Instagram where people can catch you. I started following you. You have some really great pictures there. So give everybody your socials, and then a website where they can look at some of the work you've done for the Yellowstone Wolf Project.
Sure. So a couple of good websites so my Instagram is critter_chaser. I don't, and some good websites, you can always check out the MPS website for the Wolf Project. That has all our annual reports on it. Always good to check out. We have another website that really isn't kind of associated with the Wolf Project necessarily, but has good breakdowns on the different packs, is YellowstoneWolf.org. It was at one point run by the Wolf Project, is now not, but Taylor Bland runs that, and she's a volunteer for the project at points, and is a very knowledgeable person about Yellowstone wolves. So those are a couple of good websites to check into if you're interested in wolf biology and recovery of wolves in Yellowstone National Park.
And just so everybody out there, so his Instagram is critter_chaser, in case you guys didn't hear that. He cut out a little bit there. Jeremy, this was great. Thank you so much for diving into the reintroduction and the other territories. I mean, this was great, and giving us your background. Hopefully
we get to meet you soon.
Yeah, I know. Hopefully we'll be out there and we'll be able to meet in person, not over Zoom.
Yeah, hopefully we can watch wolves together at some point when you guys are up here in the spring.
That's the plan.
That is the plan. We're looking to do that.
The wolves will be here for you if you guys can get up here.
That's all the invitation we need. Awesome. How's to all of you out there. Thanks again to Jeremy, and we'll talk to you next time.